All right, this is our last little section on chemistry for biology, for anatomy and physiology. And we're going to talk about, I'll say a little bit about acids and bases. I'll describe organic molecules and how they differ from inorganic molecules. And then I'll describe the main groups of organic molecules, their properties, and what they're used for. And so there's a picture of a manly man there, and that chemical above them, that's the chemical testosterone. And so these chemicals have important implications. And so women have just a slightly different version of that. It's called estrogen, and that's the difference, causes differences in development, in body form, fat storage, muscle development, all sorts of things. Okay, so last time, remember, we talked about how atoms interact to form chemical bonds, and these bonds join atoms to form molecules, ions, and compounds. Some atoms share electrons in covalent bonds, other atoms transfer electrons in ionic bonds. And then when you get these bonds forming, that changes the chemical properties of the molecules so that it's different from the original atoms. And the one molecule I went over was water. Water contains two hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom. And the unusual properties of water result from the fact that the covalent bond is an unequal covalent bond. And so the molecule has a negative pole and a positive pole. And water is the most abundant chemical in the human body. About 60% of the body is water. And water is an excellent solvent. It also, when we talk about water, we should mention pH. Water has a pH, pure water has a pH of 7. And that means that it has a very low concentration of hydrogen ions, 10 to the minus 7th, okay, or 1 over 10 to the 7th. Some substances that are dissolved in water will release hydrogen ions. And the more they release, the more often that you'll have a pH that's lower than 7, which means that there are more hydrogen ions. If hydrogen ions are absorbed such that there are fewer than in pure water, so that there could be 10 to the minus 14th, that's because a solution releases something that's absorbing hydrogen ions. And so that would be like a solution that has hydroxide ions. Okay, so water is an inorganic substance. It has just two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom. But many substances in the human body have carbon-hydrogen bonds, and they'll have lots of these. And this is important because carbon can form bonds with 4 different atoms. And so carbon can produce, atoms that have lots of carbon in them can produce very large molecules with chain or ring-like structures. And carbon is very good at sharing electrons, so mostly these will have covalent bonds. Living organisms are made, the most abundant substance is water, but the most important functional substances are organic. They are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Those are the 4 types. And this spider here, when you look at him, you're seeing carbohydrates and proteins, and that's it. Silk, chitin, these are all all protein and carbohydrate molecules together. And that's what you look at when you see us on the surface. You see mostly these molecules. So let's talk a little bit about each class. Okay, carbohydrates contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in a very specific ratio, 1:2 to 1. So it's carbo, and then hydrate means water. So it's like CH2O, but they usually have a chemical formula of C6H12O6, or some multiple of that. And so these are commonly known as sugars, like monosaccharides and disaccharides, glucose and sucrose. The most common one in the human body is glucose, and this can exist as a short chain, or it can fold up and form a ring. And if you connect a bunch of these glucoses together, you get a polysaccharide like starch. Very important sources of energy for the human body. Next, lipids. Lipids are long carbon-hydrogen chains, mostly with almost no oxygen and no other atoms of any kind often. And these most commonly are in the form of fatty acids. And so it might be that all the carbons are attached to hydrogens, or in some cases there'll be some, in the chain there'll be some double bonds. And so like in the center one of the linoleic acid, there's a couple double bonds. And so that's referred to as unsaturated. These are important structural molecules. They form the membranes of cells, and so they're important that way. Some of them are important in storing energy. Body fat is what are called triglycerides, which means they have 3 fatty acids. And then some of these are regulatory molecules, like steroids, like testosterone or estrogen. Okay, then the third class is a really important class. These are proteins. Proteins are really large molecules, even larger than the one I've shown you so far. They contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and always nitrogen, and then some sulfur. These things are found in amino acids. And all amino acids look like the top little thing up here. This is where it shows the amine group and the carboxyl group attached to a central carbon. Okay, and they just vary in this R group up here. There can be 20 different R groups, so there's 20 different amino acids. And then amino acids can be linked together in long chains called proteins. These proteins, they are strung together like beads on a chain, and then that chain folds up to produce secondary and tertiary structures. So it folds in 3 dimensions, and sometimes you can even have several chains folding together. This means you can make proteins into really complex structures, and these structures have lots of functions, like they form enzymes that control chemical reactions. They can be defense molecules like antibodies. They can be transport molecules like hemoglobin. They could be support or structural molecules like collagen or keratin. Our muscles contain proteins for movement. Some proteins serve as regulatory molecules like growth hormone or insulin. And others are used to store things. We'll refer a lot to proteins because they have many, many important structures. Among the most important structures is the idea that proteins act as enzymes. They can take molecules, temporarily bind to them, and force them in a position where they're likely to react. This reduces the amount of energy needed to get them to react, and then they can release them so that they can be used again. All our chemical reactions in our body are controlled essentially by proteins. Okay, then the last class of organic molecules in the human body are nucleic acids. These contain carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, and phosphorus, and these things are arranged in basic units called nucleotides. And so a nucleic acid is built of nucleotides. And here's a nucleotide for you in this picture here. There's a phosphate group, there's a sugar, either ribose or deoxyribose, and then there's a nitrogenous base, and this can vary. There are 5 different types of nitrogenous bases in nucleotides. Adenine, guanine, and cytosine occur in both DNA and RNA. Thymine is in DNA only, and uracil is in RNA only. And so those are the 2 major classes, and they differ, again, in the sugar and in the bases. DNA is double-stranded nucleic acid, and it's found in the nucleus of our cells, and it's the inherited material, the genetic material that's passed down from parent to offspring. When cells copy themselves, they have to copy the DNA to ensure the new cell gets the instructions that they need. And these instructions occur in the sequence of bases. This is forming a code for making proteins. Okay, and to make a protein, we need the second type of nucleic acid, RNA. This is a single-stranded nucleotide shown at the bottom of this page. It has a slightly different sugar and a slight change in the bases. And RNA is made to regulate DNA and to make proteins. And so there's several types of RNA. Okay, there are also other nucleotides. These nucleotides are sometimes used in energy metabolism. And so we'll talk a lot about adenosine triphosphate, which has adenine, the sugar ribose, and then it has 3 phosphate units. And this is how we store energy. Okay, so in summary, organic molecules have bonds between carbon and hydrogen atoms. They often form long chains or rings. There are four general classes: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And functionally, these are the important molecules in people. Nucleic acids store and activate inherited information. Chains of nucleotides form both DNA and RNA. The nucleotide sequence in DNA forms a code for making proteins, and RNA is useful in that. And then proteins form enzymes, structures, transports, and all sorts of other things. Okay, we'll go over this in class or in say a little bit about this again in the meetings and um, take the quiz and do the forum.